Hey guys, tonight we begin with whispers carried on the wind. Rumors of something dark and unsettling, drifting toward Europe from lands far away. You can almost hear the murmur at a market stall, sailors talking of sickness across the sea, merchants describing caravans where men fell suddenly, coughing, their bodies covered in swellings. No one knows yet what it means, but the unease is there, like a storm cloud still hidden beyond the horizon. And let's be honest, if you were alive back then, you probably wouldn't last a week. Forget antibiotics, forget running to a pharmacy for flu medicine. You'd be lucky to get a pouch of dried herbs and a prayer muttered over your head. You sure wouldn't survive with your modern habit of skipping vegetables for pizza 3 nights in a row. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The plague doesn't start with a bang, it starts with quiet. In the mid-14th century, strange accounts trickle in from the edges of Europe. Traders who've traveled the Silk Road bring back more than silk. They talk about towns in Asia suddenly emptied, about caravans where half the men never made it back. Ships returning from the Black Sea carry not just spices and grain, but stories of disease that strikes like lightning. You can imagine sitting in a tavern, listening to a sailor swear that he saw corpses piled at the harbor of Kaffa, left unburied because there weren't enough living hands. At first, people dismiss it. Every generation has its stories of distant calamities, after all. And disease is no stranger here. Smallpox, leprosy, fevers that burn through villages. Life itself is fragile, and rumors often grow taller the farther they travel. But these whispers carry a chill, because they come again and again, from different mouths, from different roads, and always with the same dark thread, a sickness no one escapes. You hear that it begins with swellings, great painful lumps under the arms and in the groin. Then come fevers, delirium, and within days death. Some say it spreads through breath itself, others that it leaps from fleas to humans. Of course, no one in your century understands bacteria or germs. They talk instead of corrupted air, foul winds blown across continents. Still, the details repeat with uncanny precision, enough to stir unease in even the most skeptical listener. Imagine being a merchant in Genoa or Venice, hearing these tales over a cup of wine. You laugh nervously, because what else can you do? But later, lying in bed, you find yourself staring at the ceiling, thinking, if it could wipe out whole towns there, what happens if it reaches here? You press your face into the pillow, trying to push away the thought, but the silence of the night makes it louder. The truth is, the world of the Middle Ages is already stretched thin. Harvests are unpredictable, famines strike, wars rumble across kingdoms. People cling to faith and routine, but stability is fragile. And into this fragile balance, something terrible is coming, something no sword can fend off, no prayer can easily deflect. You walk through a bustling medieval port city, hearing the noise of trade, shouts of dockworkers, the stink of fish, the creak of ships. And yet beneath the noise, those whispers linger. Someone mutters that a caravan from the east arrived half empty. Another swears that a whole family in Constantinople died within days of each other. A priest shakes his head, insisting it's punishment for sin. Each story adds a stone to the weight pressing on your chest. Some even claim to have seen signs in the sky, strange lights, comets, eclipses. People read them as omens, as if heaven itself is warning of what's to come. Historians still debate how much these celestial events fueled panic. But in a world where natural disasters are read as divine messages, even the stars feel dangerous. And so as the first whispers settle into minds across Europe, life continues, plowing fields, selling goods, raising children. But there's a tension now, a nervous glance over the shoulder, a question that won't go away. What if the storm isn't just rumor? What if it's already rolling closer? The plague hasn't arrived yet, but its shadow has. And shadows, as you'll soon learn, can spread just as fast as sickness. The whispers swell into something heavier now, because rumors don't stay rumors. When ships roll into harbor with sails still full of wind, but crews strangely quiet, you stand on the docks of Messina in Sicily, the year 1347, where merchant vessels from the Black Sea have just arrived. At first, the townsfolk crane their necks eagerly. Ships mean grain, goods, stories from afar. But as the gangplanks clatter down, the truth spills out. These ships are death ships, carrying not only silks and spices, but sailors coughing, feverish, their skin marred with black swellings. Some lie lifeless on the deck, abandoned to the sun. The crowd recoils, and suddenly the markets don't matter anymore. Imagine the shock of it. One day, life feels normal. You haggle for bread, you gossip about taxes, and the next, the docks become a scene out of a nightmare. Bodies are rushed off, families scatter, priests hurry with incense and prayers. And yet the damage is already done. The plague doesn't ask for permission. It slips ashore in 1,000 tiny ways, in fleas clinging to rats, in breath shared too closely, in the hands that grasped a sailor's sleeve before realizing what clung there. Within days, the city changes. Doors shutter tight, the streets quiet except for the sound of bells tolling endlessly. Processions of priests wind through alleys carrying crosses, chanting solemn prayers. Mothers clutch children tighter, whispers dart between neighbors. Did you hear about the merchant's wife? The baker's son is already gone. Fear spreads even faster than the disease, and you feel it seep into your bones just listening. But ports are not walls. They are doors. And Sicily, sitting like a stepping stone in the Mediterranean, cannot keep the sickness to itself. Ships sail north, east, and west, carrying the plague with them. Genoa, Venice, Marseille. Each in turn greets the same arrival. Not trade, not prosperity, but pestilence. The irony is cruel. The very roots that built Europe's wealth now deliver its greatest terror. Trade, once celebrated as a lifeline, becomes the road of ruin. You imagine standing on the deck of one of those ships, the salty wind whipping your hair while below. A rat scurries from sack to sack, its fleas searching for warmth. No one pays it attention. Why would they? Rats are everywhere. But here in their tiny bodies, they carry the invisible killers that will soon topple kingdoms. It's almost absurd, isn't it? Empires rise and fall, battles rage, crowns glitter with jewels, and the true conquerors of the 14th century weigh less than a coin and live in shadows. Some towns try to resist. They close gates, guard walls, turn away travelers. But it's too late. The plague rides too many carriers, slips too easily through cracks. A single sack of grain, a single sailor slipping ashore, a single flea jumping from fur to cloth is enough to undo all precautions. Cities that once seemed invincible find themselves brought low in weeks. Still, not everyone believes. Some dismiss it as exaggeration, others as punishment meant only for sinners elsewhere. But denial melts quickly when neighbors cough blood and children's fevers burn too hot to cool. You walk through Messina again, hearing the chaos. Doctors rushing without hope, priests reciting last rites in a dozen homes at once, dogs barking in the distance where carts carry the dead away. The harbor smells not of salt and fish, but of sickness itself, and yet ships keep moving. They cannot stop. Trade doesn't sleep, and neither does desperation. Hunger drives men to sail even when death waits on deck. And with every voyage, the plague leaps farther, faster, unstoppable. As you leave the harbor behind, one truth sinks in. The sea, once a highway of opportunity, has become a black mirror, reflecting only dread. And Europe, still unaware of the storm's full fury, is already sinking into its grip. The harbor scene lingers in your mind. The cries, the stench, the eerie silence of ships that should have been bustling with trade. From Sicily, the sickness fans outward like ink spilling across parchment. Messina becomes only the first entry in a grim ledger. By the time anyone thinks to warn their neighbors, the plague has already outrun their words. Picture the island itself, a jewel of the Mediterranean, its hills bright with olive trees, its markets noisy with barter. Within weeks, silence swallows those markets. Priests march through streets swinging censers, the smoke of incense heavy in the air, as if fragrance could fight infection. Families shut doors and hang rags soaked in vinegar across windows, believing sour air might block the sickness. None of it works. The buboes bloom all the same. Dark swellings under arms and at groins, painful to the touch, grotesque to see. Neighbors cross themselves at the sight and whisper prayers no louder than the flutter of a sparrow's wings. The news spreads inland quickly. Farmers who bring grain to town return to their villages pale and feverish. A shepherd wanders home coughing, his flock left unattended. In the monasteries, monks who tended the sick now lie still on straw beds, their hands folded across chests. Death moves quietly, but its trail is obvious. Untended fields, empty cottages, bells tolling more often than they ever rang for celebration. And yet, not all react with despair. Some flee, abandoning homes, families, even entire villages, hoping that distance will be enough. Others cling to their routines stubbornly, baking bread, mending nets, ploughing fields, as if pretending normal life can somehow hold the plague at bay. You can almost admire the denial, though you know it offers no protection. It's like trying to hide from a thunderstorm under a tablecloth. Ships leaving Sicily carry more than grain and wine. They carry a passenger invisible yet unstoppable. Genoa, Venice, Marseille, each port takes its turn at terror. The disease doesn't march like an army. It leaps erratic, appearing here, then there, as if mocking any attempt to predict its path. Historians still debate whether it was fleas on rats, or breath passed from person to person, or both. But what matters is that people felt surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see. Imagine yourself on a narrow medieval street. Houses leaning so close their rooftops nearly touch. Laundry flutters overhead. A child's toy lies forgotten in the dirt. And suddenly the sound you hear isn't play, it's coughing. Someone leans from a window, pale, gasping. The neighbors slam shutters. You keep walking, heart pounding, feeling the invisible weight of air pressing against your lungs. Sicily becomes Europe's warning bell, though too few heed it. The plague is no longer a rumor from distant lands. It is here devouring one of the continent's stepping stones, and as ships continue to sail, as merchants continue to trade, as pilgrims continue to wander, the shadow stretches farther each day. By the end of that first winter, Sicily has become a land of whispers and empty chairs. Fires burn in pits outside town walls, smoke rising into the sky like mute prayers. Dogs root through alleys for scraps, unbothered now by human shouts. The island has changed, not by war, not by politics, but by something smaller than the eye can see, and greater than fear itself. And you sense it in your bones. This is only the beginning. From Sicily, the plague moves with a speed that feels almost supernatural, faster than letters, faster than prayers, faster even than fear itself. You trace its path like sparks leaping from a fire. One ember lands in Genoa, another in Venice, another in Marseille, and suddenly entire regions are ablaze. No army could march this quickly. No king could conquer so thoroughly. The plague spreads as if the wind itself were carrying it, curling into every port, every valley, every street. You picture the map of Europe, towns like stars on dark parchment. One by one, those stars blink out. A caravan arrives in Pisa. Within weeks, families barricade themselves in houses only to be carried out on carts. A merchant returns to Paris. Soon the city hums not with music, but with funeral bells clanging until even the living feel hollow. In England, sailors bring the sickness ashore at Dorset, and from there it ripples inward, faster than anyone can flee. The speed is what terrifies most. Villages hear rumors and then, almost in the same breath, watch those rumors arrive at their own doors. The symptoms appear with cruel suddenness. One day a man is walking to market, joking with neighbors. The next he staggers with fever, skin hot and damp. By evening, dark buboes swell beneath his arms, his groin. Neighbors avoid his eyes, whispering prayers but keeping their distance. Within 3 days, he is gone. Sometimes families vanish in a single week. Parents, children, grandparents, houses left as silent as tombs. You walk past rows of shuttered windows, the wood splintering, as though the very buildings are dying alongside their owners. Panic changes people. Some grow wild with fear, fleeing into the countryside, abandoning even loved ones. Others plunge into reckless abandon, drinking, singing, clinging to joy as if mocking death. And then there are those who retreat into silence, muttering prayers, clutching rosaries until their fingers bleed. It's chaos not only in the streets, but in hearts, as everyone scrambles to make sense of an enemy that cannot be seen, heard, or fought with sword or shield. The church bells never stop. They toll morning, noon, and night, sometimes for so many deaths at once that priests give blessings over entire pits rather than bodies one by one. Gravediggers collapse from exhaustion, their hands blistered from shovels, their eyes hollow. At night the sound doesn't fade. You lie awake hearing it echo, a reminder that tomorrow it may toll for you. And yet amid the terror you stumble on strange moments of survival, a child skipping stones in a river, oblivious to the shadow around him. A woman weaving cloth by firelight, determined to finish a garment though her neighbors have vanished. A monk writing in his chronicle, recording the deaths with calm precision, even as his own brothers cough in the cloister. Life clings stubbornly, absurdly, even as death presses in. Historians still argue how many died in those first surges, millions upon millions, perhaps half of Europe within only a few years. But numbers cannot capture the fire's speed, the way it devoured families and cities before people could even understand what was happening. Imagine a storm that doesn't pass, but simply moves and moves and moves until the whole sky is dark. By the time spring rolls around, the plague is no longer a series of outbreaks. It's a continent-wide blaze. The fire that began with whispers and ships now burns from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, and there is no corner left untouched. And as you look at the smoldering wreckage, you realize with a chill, this isn't even the full fury yet. The fire is still spreading. The fire spreads, and with it comes the most dreaded sign, the black swellings that give the plague its terrible name. You see them first as small lumps beneath the skin, tender to the touch, growing in the armpits, the groin, along the neck. They rise like dark grapes, angry and swollen, pulsing with pain. People call them buboes, but the word hardly captures their horror. They are the visible stamp of death, as unmistakable as storm clouds on the horizon. You walk through a village and watch as a man clutches his side, grimacing. Within hours, the swelling grows, turning red, then purple, then nearly black. His wife dabs it with vinegar-soaked cloth, whispering prayers, but the fever climbs. Soon his body shakes, sweat pouring off him, his eyes glassy with delirium. By nightfall, he is too weak to move, and by dawn, his neighbors are already hammering together a coffin. The buboes do not wait, and neither does death. Some victims survive a little longer, staggering through streets, pressing their swollen lumps as if trying to hold death inside their skin. Children stare wide-eyed, pulling back from them in terror. Neighbors whisper, "He has the marks," and doors slam shut. In a society where community means survival, the buboes turn people into exiles in their own homes. The pain is said to be unbearable, like fire beneath the flesh. Some accounts describe victims lancing the swellings, hoping to release poison. Others smear them with strange concoctions, poultices of onions, butter, herbs, even dried toad. Nothing works. The blackness spreads, crawling across skin in blotches, staining faces, arms, legs. The body becomes a canvas of fear, painted in bruises no healer can scrub away. And yet amid the horror there are oddities. Some swellings shrink and vanish, leaving survivors weak but alive. A neighbor whispers, "God has spared him," while another mutters, "The devil marked him but changed his mind." Historians still debate whether certain people had natural resistance or simply luck. To those living through it, survival felt like a miracle, unpredictable and rare. The buboes also created confusion. Not all victims showed them. Some collapsed from sudden fevers, coughing blood, dead within a day, what later scholars would call the pneumonic form. Others seemed healthy in the morning and gone by evening. No marks at all. The variety of symptoms made people desperate for explanations. Was it the air, the stars, God's wrath, or witchcraft? Theories piled up like bodies, none offering comfort. The sight of the buboes spread terror, even before the sickness itself arrived. A single traveler showing swellings could clear a street in seconds. Mothers dragged children indoors. Shopkeepers bolted shutters. Priests muttered prayers under their breath. The marks became symbols not only of disease but of isolation. Once the buboes appeared, you were not only dying, you were already dead to your community. Picture yourself waking with a dull ache under your arm. You press it, feel a lump, wince at the pain. A thought flickers. Maybe it's just a boil. But then you remember the stories, the warnings, the bells tolling each morning. Fear squeezes tighter than the swelling itself. Do you tell your family? Do you hide it, or do you simply sit in silence waiting for the inevitable? The buboes didn't just attack the body. They gnawed at the mind. By now Europe is filled with them. Swellings beneath rags, hidden beneath tunics, whispered about in alleys, revealed in deathbeds. They are the black signatures of a plague that has no mercy. Each one another name added to death's ledger. And as the shadows deepen, you realize the fire of plague is no longer invisible. It writes itself across human skin in letters no one can ignore. You've seen the black swellings, the bruises that spread like ink across skin, and now you watch what happens when a whole city sees them too. Panic doesn't arrive quietly. It bursts into the streets, wild and contagious in its own way. People stumble out of houses carrying the sick, begging for help that no one dares to give. Doors slam, shutters bang, and the once lively hum of markets and taverns twists into chaos. In Florence, in Paris, in London, the pattern is the same. One day the city bustles, the next it collapses into fear. Bread sellers vanish, taverns lock up. Apprentices run from workshops, leaving tools scattered on benches. You hear the clatter of carts not carrying goods but corpses, their wheels squeaking under weight. Priests hurry through alleys, muttering last rites as quickly as lips can move, unable to keep up with the tide of the dying. And all around you the same cry, keep away. Families fracture under the strain. Some abandon sick loved ones, too terrified to touch them. A husband slips out of his house, leaving his wife and children behind, hoping distance might save him. A mother shuts the door on her own feverish son, sobbing as she bolts it. You recoil, horrified, but in that world survival pushes compassion aside. It's brutal but very human. When death breathes on your neck, even love trembles. And then there are the opposite reactions, those who throw themselves into reckless living. Taverns, when they dare open, brim with people drinking as though tomorrow doesn't exist. Gambling dens fill, songs ring louder, laughter borders on hysteria. If we're doomed, they say, why not enjoy the fall? It's gallows humor made flesh, a dance on the edge of the grave. You almost want to laugh with them, until the cough in the corner reminds you why they're laughing so hard. The city authorities try to restore order. Guards patrol streets, shouting commands to keep people indoors. Some towns issue laws banning gatherings, processions, even funerals. But fear makes people slippery. They slip out under cover of night, flee to countryside cottages, or sneak into cities seeking refuge. Ironically, every attempt to escape only spreads the sickness further. Markets, once the heart of city life, become ghostly. Stalls stand empty, vegetables rot in baskets, dogs nose through abandoned bread. The smell of incense hangs heavy as priests burn it in streets, convinced it will purify the air. Citizens carry posies of herbs, press them to their faces, hoping floral scents will shield them from corruption. Children mimic their parents, clutching flowers like toys, their wide eyes giving away the truth. They don't really believe the flowers will help, but they need something to hold. And then, the violence. Crowds turn suspicious, looking for someone to blame. Outsiders are chased from towns, strangers beaten in alleys. Rumors swirl that wells have been poisoned, that sorcery fuels the plague. Scapegoats multiply as panic deepens, because it is easier to lash out at neighbors than admit helplessness. You feel the tension like static in the air, ready to spark into cruelty at the smallest excuse. The soundscape of the city shifts too. No longer the chatter of markets, the clang of blacksmiths, the gossip of neighbors. Now it's bells tolling endlessly, wheels of death carts creaking, dogs barking in empty streets. Sometimes in the dead of night, you hear screams, a fevered patient in delirium or a family realizing too late they've all been marked. Sleep becomes a luxury. Fear itself keeps you awake. Imagine yourself there, standing in a narrow lane, torchlight flickering against stone walls. A man stumbles past, clutching his side, his face gray. Behind him, his wife cries out for help, but every door stays closed. The street feels both crowded with suffering and empty of hope. You grip your cloak tighter, your breath shallow, wondering if the air itself carries death, and you realize panic doesn't just happen in the streets. It seeps into minds, turning neighbors into strangers, homes into prisons, and every cough into a death sentence. The streets reek of fear and smoke, and into that chaos step figures who look more like nightmares than saviors. You catch sight of them through the torchlight, long dark cloaks, gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and, most unsettling of all, faces hidden behind great curved beaks. They're the physicians of the plague, though to you they look more like carrion birds than healers. Children cry at the sight, adults cross themselves, and you can't blame them. If Batman had villains in the 14th century, this would be the costume. The beak masks weren't just for drama. They were stuffed with herbs, vinegar-soaked sponges, and spices, lavender, rosemary, cloves, even camphor. Anything thought to cleanse the foul miasmas, the corrupted air people believed spread the disease. Doctors breathed through those stuffed beaks, convinced the sweet smells would shield them. Of course, you know today it wasn't the air itself, but fleas and bacteria. But back then, the beak was their only shield. It gave them courage. even if it gave little protection. Step closer and you see their tools, long wooden canes used to poke at patients without touching them. They prod a swollen bubo here, turn a body over there, scribble notes in wax tablets while staying at arm's length. Imagine going to your doctor today, only to have them examine you with a broom handle from across the room. Comforting? Not exactly. Their treatments range from strange to downright horrifying. Bloodletting remains common, cutting veins or applying leeches to balance the humors. Others recommend poultices of onions, butter, and garlic plastered onto swellings. Some burn herbs around patients, filling chambers with smoke thick enough to choke. A few even suggest drinking potions made from crushed emeralds or ground-up pearls, luxuries that only the rich can afford. You can almost hear the apothecary whispering, "May or may not save your life, but at least you'll die fabulously." And yet, for all the oddity, these physicians are still risking their lives. Many collapse from the same sickness they tried to treat. Others flee, abandoning cities when the death toll grows too high. Records tell of entire towns without a single doctor, the sick left with only priests and family members for care. Historians still debate whether the famous plague doctors were widespread during the Black Death itself, or became more iconic in later outbreaks. But the image has stuck, a symbol of fear and futility. The desperation shows in their instructions too. Some doctors prescribe avoiding baths, fearing open pores let in the pestilence. Others recommend constant bathing in vinegar. One urges eating pickled onions daily. Another insists you should avoid fruit entirely. Imagine living in a world where your health depends on whether your doctor prefers salad or soup. You watch as one doctor leans over a patient, the beak looming, herbs muffling his breath. He lances a bubo with a sharp knife, pus spilling into a basin. The family gasps, hoping for relief, but the patient only groans, feverish eyes staring past the ceiling. The doctor scribbles a note, mutters a prayer, and moves on. It's less healing than ritual, a performance against despair. And yet, amid the strangeness, glimmers of truth shine through. Some recommend burning contaminated clothes, airing out rooms, quarantining ships, a word that comes from 40 giorni, 40 days of isolation in Venetian harbors. These measures sometimes slowed the spread, though no one fully understood why. In their fumbling, fearful way, they were stumbling toward the beginnings of public health. But still, to most, the doctors inspired dread more than comfort. Their black shapes in the doorway mean the sickness has claimed another household. The scrape of their canes on cobblestones, the scent of their herbs in the air. It all becomes part of the plague's soundscape, as familiar as bells tolling or carts creaking, and as you watch them vanish into the smoky streets, you realize the truth. The doctors weren't really fighting the plague. They were fighting despair, giving shape to hope even when their tools were useless. Sometimes in a world unraveling, even the illusion of help is better than none at all. The doctors in their bird-like masks fade into the mist, and soon another sound reaches you. Not the tolling of bells this time, but the rhythmic crack of leather on flesh. You follow it into a square where torches burn low and crowds gather, watching a strange procession move through the streets. Barefoot men march in rows, their backs bare, their eyes fixed skyward. Each one holds a whip tipped with knots of metal or bone, and with every step they lash themselves until blood spatters the ground. These are the flagellants, convinced that the only way to drive out the plague is to punish their own bodies before God does. You can feel the desperation radiating from them. They sing hymns through gritted teeth, voices trembling between pain and ecstasy. Onlookers kneel, some weeping, some joining in prayers, believing the spectacle will soften heaven's wrath. To medieval minds, disease is rarely random. Its punishment, divine correction for sins too great to ignore. If the plague is God's anger made flesh, then only suffering, repentance, and blood might calm it. The processions last for weeks. Flagellants travel from town to town, drawing crowds as large as festivals once did. Where merchants used to bring silk and spices, these men bring wounds and warnings. They preach in the squares, denouncing priests who live in comfort, lords who hoard wealth, neighbors who sin in secret. Repent. They shout, voices hoarse, repent, for the end is near. The crowd answers with sobs, with chants, with coins tossed into baskets to support their strange pilgrimage. But the church itself looks on uneasily. Some priests welcome the fervor, seeing it as proof of devotion. Others fear chaos, because the flagellant's message often undermines church authority, painting clergy as corrupt and useless. By the late 1340s, papal decrees denounce these processions, but they've already left their mark. Ordinary people have seen men bleed in the streets, seen their neighbors join them, and the image lingers long after the whips fall silent. Historians still debate whether the flagellants slowed or spread the plague as they traveled, perhaps both. But the spectacle reveals just how far people would go when reason failed. Superstition deepens too. In villages, mothers tie charms of red cloth around children's wrists, convinced it will ward off sickness. Farmers sprinkle holy water across fields. Priests carry relics in long processions through towns, and yet the plague marches on unimpressed by prayers or pain. Still, these rituals aren't pointless. They give shape to terror, turning invisible death into something you can face, however painfully. You stand at the edge of one such procession, the crack of whips echoing in your ears. The smell of sweat, blood, and incense mingles thickly in the night air. Children cling to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, half in awe and half in fear. A man collapses mid-march, bloodied and faint, but others lift him, whispering blessings, carrying him onward. It's brutal, unsettling, yet strangely human, a desperate attempt to wrestle meaning from disaster. And somewhere in the shadows, skeptics whisper. A merchant mutters that the flagellants only spread fear. A healer grumbles that whipping backs won't cure fevers. Even a priest sighs, admitting quietly that no amount of penance seems to turn back God's hand. But those doubts are swallowed by the louder rhythm of the whips, the louder cries of the crowd. For now, pain feels like prayer, and prayer feels like the only weapon left. As dawn breaks, the flagellants move on, leaving behind stained cobblestones and echoes of their chants. You're left with the uneasy thought, faith can comfort, yes, but it can also wound, bleeding hope out in the open, one lash at a time. The last echoes of the whips fade, but the fear they stirred lingers like smoke. When people cannot fight the unseen, they begin to fight the seen. And soon the plague gives birth to a new cruelty, the hunt for scapegoats. You can almost feel the shift in the air, whispers turning sharper, glances turning suspicious, neighbors looking at one another with narrowed eyes. The rumors start small. Someone mutters that the wells must have been poisoned. Another swears they saw a stranger sprinkling powder into the town fountain. Before long, the whispers knot themselves into certainty. Someone is responsible for the sickness. It can't simply be God's will or chance. There must be a hand behind it. Fear craves an enemy you can point to. And so suspicion falls on those who already live on the margins. Jews are accused in town after town, their knowledge of herbs twisted into evidence of sorcery, their separateness made into proof of guilt. Pogroms flare, whole communities attacked, houses burned, families driven out or slaughtered. You stand in a square where once trade bustled, now filled with shouting, fists and torches. The plague hasn't just killed bodies. It's poisoned trust. Foreigners too become targets. Travelers are chased from villages, beaten at gates, left to wander between towns that refuse them. Even beggars, healers, and midwives fall under suspicion. A woman with herbs in her pouch is accused of witchcraft. A poor man whose neighbor sickened is suddenly guilty of spreading disease. In a world desperate for answers, evidence doesn't matter. Fear itself becomes the proof. You watch as a group of townsfolk drag a man toward the church steps, shouting accusations. He cries innocence, but no one listens. A priest hesitates, torn between mercy and the crowd's fury. Stones are lifted, and in moments judgment falls not from heaven but from human hands. The plague feeds not only on bodies but on hatred, burning away the fragile bonds that held communities together. And yet not all yield to the frenzy. Some priests shelter the accused, some lords forbid violence, some towns hold back the tide of scapegoating. Historians still debate how widespread the attacks were, but what's clear is the temptation was everywhere. When faced with horror, people often prefer to imagine a villain than accept the randomness of nature. Superstitions multiply alongside suspicion. People wear charms against evil eyes, burn herbs to chase away imagined witches, or carve protective symbols above doors. These rituals sometimes overlap with violence. One neighbor hangs garlic, another sharpens knives, both convinced they're defending their families. You can't help but shake your head. It's as though the plague has spread not just through breath and fleas, but through thoughts themselves, infecting logic. Imagine the silence that follows such violence. Streets empty, shutters stay closed, and ashes from burned homes drift into the air. The plague has not been stopped, of course not. But the community is smaller, weaker, fractured. Fear has claimed victory without lifting a single sickle, and as you walk away from the scene, the truth presses in heavy. The sickness kills quickly, but suspicion kills quietly, leaving wounds that last long after the fevers fade. The shouting fades, the smoke of burned houses drifts away, and now you find yourself walking through a silence far heavier than any noise. You've stepped into an abandoned village, once alive with chatter, now emptied by the plague. The streets are still there, the houses still stand, but everything else is gone. A door hangs open, swaying in the wind. A cart lies overturned, its wheels sunk in mud. Chickens wander freely, pecking at weeds growing in the square as if the birds have inherited the earth. The quiet is unsettling. You expect laughter from children, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the gossip of women at the well, but all you hear is wind through broken shutters. Even the dogs have grown strange here, roaming in packs, their eyes wary, their growls echoing against stone walls. Without people, the village feels like a shell, still shaped by human life but hollowed out. Imagine walking past a cottage window and seeing a table still set for dinner, wooden bowls, a loaf of bread hardened to stone, a pitcher of water half emptied. The family never finished their meal. You glance into another house and find beds unmade, clothes scattered, as though people left in a rush. But there is no sign of where they went. Some fled, some died, some perhaps both. The plague didn't just kill, it erased. Fields lie untended, wheat bending and breaking under its own weight. Orchards heavy with fruit no one will pick. In the barns, livestock cry for food or worse, lie silent on the straw. Nature doesn't pause for grief. Grass grows over doorsteps, ivy crawls across walls, birds nest in rafters where people once prayed. The rhythm of life continues, but without humans to notice. Chroniclers wrote of whole villages disappearing in these years, sometimes so completely that travelers stumbled on ruins with no memory of who had lived there. In some regions, a third or even half of the population was gone within a few short years. Imagine if half your city vanished, not over generations but between two birthdays. Historians still argue whether those numbers are exaggerated, but even the most cautious admit the scale was staggering. And what of those who did survive in abandoned places? You picture a single old man sitting in front of a cold hearth, his family gone, his neighbors gone, the silence pressing harder than hunger. Or a child wandering through alleys, calling names that no one answers, clutching a doll in one hand. Survivors found themselves surrounded not by community, but by ghosts of one. The emptiness carried practical consequences too. Roads became dangerous as fewer travelers passed. Bandits took to forests preying on the desperate. With fewer hands to plow and sow, famine sometimes followed plague, doubling the suffering. The absence itself was as deadly as the disease, and yet strangely opportunity flickered here. In some places, empty land meant new chances for those bold enough to claim it. Abandoned fields could be farmed by peasants who once had nothing. Houses stood waiting for new owners. Life, stubborn as weeds, found ways to creep back in. You almost smile at the thought. The plague erased, but it also reshuffled, rewriting who could own, who could thrive, who could dream. Still, as you leave the silent village behind, the image clings to you, the empty square, the creaking door, the bread turned to stone. You can't help but imagine walking through your own neighborhood and hearing nothing but wind. That's what the plague left behind. Not only death, but silence that could swallow entire worlds. The silence of empty villages stays with you. But when you walk closer to the town, still clinging to life, you hear another sound rising above it, shovels striking earth. Again and again, the dull thud of wood and iron breaking soil, the rasp of breath from exhausted men. These are the grave diggers, the ones who face death not as rumor or shadow, but as a daily burden. As physical as dirt under their nails, you picture them at dawn, trudging out beyond the city walls with spades slung over shoulders, passing carts already piled with bodies. The corpses lie heaped, some wrapped hastily in sheets, others bare, their faces frozen mid-scream or mid-prayer. The gravediggers don't flinch anymore. At first, perhaps they did. Now the sight has numbed them. Fear dulls when routine becomes heavier than horror. Their task is simple in description, impossible in weight. Dig pits wide enough to swallow dozens, sometimes hundreds. The ground is hard, often frozen, and the stench of death clings to the air. Lime is scattered over the bodies, meant to hold back the rot, but the smell seeps through regardless. You gag as you imagine standing near one of those trenches, smoke from nearby fires mixing with the sickly sweetness of decay. Some gravediggers work for coin, others under orders, some merely because no one else will. They cover their mouths with cloth, dip rags in vinegar, mutter prayers as they shovel. A few drink heavily to steady their nerves, staggering but determined. And still, many of them die too, struck down by the same sickness they try to bury. New hands take their place, until even the gravediggers themselves need gravediggers. The carts that feed these pits are part of the rhythm. Wheels squeak, drivers shout for help, bodies are tipped unceremoniously into trenches. Families who once hoped for proper burials can no longer afford them, or priests cannot keep up with prayers. The plague reduces all to anonymity. Nobles, peasants, priests, merchants, all laid side by side in common ground, their names forgotten before the dirt even closes. And yet, even in this grim work, strange details emerge. Some bodies are buried with flowers tucked beside them, perhaps by grieving loved ones. A rosary slips from one corpse's hand. A child's wooden toy is laid on another's chest. Tiny fragments of humanity peek through the mountain of death, reminders that even in haste, the living try to remember the dignity of the gone. Historians still debate whether mass graves were as widespread as described, or whether later chroniclers exaggerated. But whether hundreds or dozens, the image remains. Pits yawning wide, filled with bodies stacked like firewood. And the sound, always the sound of shovels striking earth day after day, until the ground itself seems weary of swallowing. You stand at the edge of one such grave now, torchlight flickering across the uneven earth. The gravediggers work in silence, except for the occasional cough, the scrape of metal, the grunt of effort. One wipes his brow, smearing dirt across his face. Another pauses to whisper a prayer, before heaving another body into the pit. The air is thick with the weight of their labor, heavy enough to press on your chest, and you realize these men are not just burying the dead. They are burying hope, burying memory, burying the very rhythm of daily life. Each shovel of dirt is another reminder that the world has tilted, and nothing will ever be quite the same again. The scrape of shovels fades, but the echoes remain, heavier than silence. And then, almost unexpectedly, another sound emerges in the midst of despair. Songs. Not joyous ones, not hymns of celebration, but strange little verses whispered by children, hummed by workers, carried through plague-ridden streets like nervous laughter in a dark room. You hear a group of children skipping in a circle, their cheeks thin, their eyes bright in torchlight. They sing a rhyme, soft at first, then louder, stamping feet to a rhythm that feels both playful and eerie. It's the ring-around game, the kind of song that would survive centuries, even when its original meaning blurred. A circle of kids, a burst of giggles, and then all of them tumbling to the ground with a shout, "We all fall down." You shiver. It's innocent on the surface, yet in these streets the words bite deeper. Children mimic what they see, falling, collapsing silence. Even play becomes a reflection of death. Adults, too, turn grief into rhythm. In cities across Europe, plague songs emerge, chants about the dead, satirical verses mocking fate, laments sung in taverns half empty. Some sound like prayers, others like curses. You imagine sitting in a smoky inn, a weary voice rising in song about carts piled with corpses, the chorus picked up by others too tired to laugh but too alive to stay silent. The melody doesn't banish fear, but it makes it bearable, turning horror into something you can hum. And then there's the dance macabre, the dance of death. Artists paint skeletons hand in hand with kings, peasants, nuns, and children, all whirling in a great eternal circle. It isn't just art, it's performance. Processions sometimes end with actors dressed as death itself, pulling living dancers into their steps. Watching it, you feel the message keenly. No rank, no wealth, no prayer keeps you from the final dance. Equal parts satire and sermon, it presses the truth into hearts more effectively than any sermon could. But not all songs are grim. Some are almost defiant, mocking the plague with bawdy verses and ridiculous rhymes. Gallows humor, sharp and strange, thrives even here. Imagine villagers shouting rhymes about kissing despite the risk, or about drinking so much ale that death itself staggers to keep up. It's foolish, but it's survival. Laughter, however dark, keeps despair from crushing completely. Historians still argue whether these rhymes and dances were direct products of the Black Death or later creations inspired by memory. But you sense the truth in the rhythm itself. When words fail, people sing. When grief overflows, people dance. Culture doesn't stop for catastrophe. It bends, reshapes, and sometimes grows sharper. As night deepens, you walk past a square where torches gutter low. Children's voices echo faintly. The skipping, the chanting, the tumble to the ground. In another street, you hear a deeper voice humming a dirge, slow and steady, as if to mark time until dawn. The city, broken and afraid, still finds ways to make music from its pain. And you realize, even when surrounded by death, humans cannot stop singing. The songs are not victories, they're shields, thin as paper, but strong enough to give courage for one more day. The eerie songs linger in your ears as you step into the cramped quarters of a healer's home, where shelves sag beneath jars of powders, bundles of dried herbs, and bottles filled with liquids of suspicious colors. The plague is everywhere, and with it comes desperation so thick you can taste it. If death cannot be stopped by prayer or song, then surely some concoction, some ritual, some remedy, no matter how strange, must work. The smell here is overwhelming. Vinegar, garlic, crushed flowers, and something sharper, perhaps sulfur. A woman ties herbs into little pouches to wear around the neck, swearing they keep the sickness at bay. Another stirs a pot of onion paste, claiming it should be spread over swellings to draw out the poison. You watch as she slathers it onto her husband's bubo, the poor man groaning with pain. The air feels heavy with hope as much as smoke, though you suspect the hope is thinner than the herbs. Some remedies border on absurd. Powdered emerald, ground fine and swallowed with wine, is recommended for the wealthy, because if you can't beat the plague, you might as well die expensively. Others swear by rubbing crushed toads onto skin, or placing plucked feathers inside shoes. One treatise even suggests sitting between two blazing fires, so the heat burns the corruption out of your body. Imagine the medieval version of a sauna, except instead of detox, you just end up roasted and coughing. Then there are the cures more grotesque. Animal parts ground into powders, urine used as disinfectant, leeches applied until skin runs slick with blood. Some patients are bled until they faint, only to die faster. Others are forced to drink concoctions of mercury or arsenic, poisons more lethal than the disease itself. You shiver as you picture it. Patients writhing not only from plague, but from the remedies that were supposed to help. Still, not all efforts are nonsense. Vinegar washes may have slowed infection in some cases. Burning contaminated clothes, airing out houses, or quarantining ships. Those measures actually helped, though no one fully understood why. Some herbs like sage or thyme carried mild antiseptic properties, but for every flicker of truth, there were 10 shadows of superstition. The line between medicine and magic blurred constantly, and often the two were one and the same. The poor relied on charms as much as potions. Amulets with prayers engraved, crosses worn tightly, even coins strung around the neck as talismans. People clutched these objects desperately, believing that faith carried in metal or wood might succeed where priests and physicians had failed. The placebo effect was alive and well, even if no one had a name for it. And then there were the smells. People believed foul air carried the plague, so they fought it with stronger scents. Flowers, perfumes, burning juniper, or even piles of herbs smoldering in homes. Rich citizens filled their rooms with roses and lavender, while the poor lit damp straw or dung, choking themselves on smoke to ward off invisible dangers. You imagine trying to sleep in a room thick with smoke, eyes watering, lungs burning, comforted only by the thought that worse air might be outside. Historians still debate how widespread these bizarre remedies were and which ones had kernels of truth. But what's clear is this: people would try anything. When every day brings new funerals, when buboes swell and fevers rage, even the most outlandish promise feels worth the attempt. You step back into the street, the scent of herbs clinging to your clothes, and you realize something unsettling. The remedies, strange and desperate as they were, weren't really about curing the plague. They were about curing fear, giving people something to do, some way to fight back, even if the battle was already lost. The pungent haze of herbs and smoke fades, and now the soundscape changes again. It is not the toll of bells or the scrape of shovels this time. It is the absence of laughter. You walk into a lane where children once chased hoops and kicked rag-stuffed balls, and the silence presses harder than any scream. The plague has found its smallest victims, And their absence feels like the heaviest blow of all. Imagine a cottage where toys lie scattered on the floor, a carved wooden horse, a doll of rags, a hoop leaning against the wall. The hearth still glows faintly, but the laughter that once filled the space has gone. Parents sit in stunned silence, faces hollow, as if the house itself has lost its soul. Losing a child in any age is cruel, but in the Middle Ages, where children carried not only joy, but the promise of family survival, it strikes like lightning. Some children sicken quickly, fever rising, buboes swelling, their small bodies too fragile to fight. Others collapse without warning, gone in a single night. Chroniclers wrote of entire families vanishing in days, leaving cradles overturned, lullabies unfinished. You see a mother rocking back and forth in an empty room, still humming softly, as if the child were only asleep. The sound drifts through the doorway, heartbreak carried on a whisper. And yet, strangely, children also become mirrors of the world around them. Some mimic plague rituals in their play, turning the horrors they see into games. They dance in circles, singing rhymes about flowers, ashes, and falling down. To them, it's just a chant. To adults, it's a haunting echo of reality. You watch them collapse in giggles at the end of the rhyme, and the sound chills you. Play becomes prophecy, innocence reshaped into reflection. Orphans multiply as the plague rolls on. Streets fill with children wandering alone, clutching scraps of bread, begging at doorways already shut in fear. Some are taken in by monasteries, nuns offering what care they can. Others fall into lives of theft, clinging to survival any way possible. The sight of a child standing alone in a crowded market square, eyes wide, hands empty, it becomes a symbol of the plague's cruelest theft. Historians still debate how deeply the plague reduced birth rates, how long communities struggled to recover, but there is no debate about its psychological scar. Imagine being a parent watching your child grow pale, coughing, fading, while you can do nothing but pray and hold on until the last breath. The helplessness itself becomes a wound that never fully heals, and yet life clings stubbornly even here. Some children survive, baffling neighbors. A fever breaks suddenly. A bubo shrinks and a child who seemed gone sits up blinking at the light. Parents call it a miracle. Neighbors call it fortune. Priests call it God's mercy. The survivors carry those memories forever. Children who grow up scarred, their songs tinged with shadows, their games haunted by memories of silence. You walk out of the lane and glance back one last time at the empty toys, the half-sung lullabies, the quiet that feels louder than bells. And you understand. The plague wasn't only terrible because it killed, it was terrible because it stole laughter, the sound that makes life bearable. The silence of children fades behind you, and now you step into the heart of a city, its market square. This is usually the beating pulse of medieval life, where vendors shout, haggling fills the air, and colors of cloth, fruit, and pottery spill across stalls. But now the square feels like a ghost. Wooden booths stand half-collapsed, baskets lie overturned, apples rotting in heaps. The only sound is the flap of cloth in the wind, like a banner at a battlefield long after soldiers have gone. Trade has withered as surely as the crops in abandoned fields. Merchants fear traveling, ships rot in harbor, caravans vanish from the roads. A market once bursting with spice, wool, and fish now offers nothing but echoes. Bread is scarce, meat scarcer still, and coins lose their meaning when there's no one left to sell. Imagine walking into your local supermarket and finding shelves bare, clerks vanished, the light still buzzing overhead, like a stage set after the actors have fled. That's what the plague has done to Europe's markets. The famine that follows compounds the misery. With so few farmers left, fields go untilled, herds wander untended, and food that does reach cities is sold at staggering prices. A single loaf of bread becomes treasure. Families sell heirlooms for grain. Nobles open stores of grain only to close them quickly, fearing riots. You picture men shoving one another over sacks of flour, guards swinging staves to keep the peace, and the air thick with hunger and desperation. Some try to adapt. Markets move outdoors, spread thinly to keep bad air away. Buyers cover their noses with flowers, sellers shout from a distance rather than lean close. Coins are dipped in vinegar before being exchanged, glistening wet as though money itself has caught the disease. It's awkward, strange, almost comical. Imagine doing your shopping today while refusing to touch the cashier, both of you yelling about the price of onions from opposite ends of the aisle. But humor thins quickly when hunger gnaws. Riots break out in some towns. Cart of grain meant for nobles is seized by the crowd. Loaves ripped apart before they even cool. Bakers are accused of hoarding, sometimes dragged from ovens to face angry mobs. Desperation sharpens suspicion, and suspicion often ends in blood. The plague doesn't just kill bodies, it strangles economy. Guilds lose half their members, trade fairs vanish, ships sit idle, the great wheels of commerce creak to a halt. Even kings feel the pinch as tax revenues collapse, their coffers shrinking while expenses for war and defense remain. The collapse of markets is the collapse of stability itself, and yet amid the desolation, odd opportunities emerge. Survivors find themselves wealthier than before, not in coins but in access. An apprentice who once fetched water now inherits his master's workshop. A widow takes over her husband's stall, suddenly in charge of trade she was once excluded from. Markets look empty now, but seeds of new futures sprout quietly in their ruins. You wander through the square one last time, pausing by an abandoned stall where a scale still rests, one pan tipped as if mid-transaction. You imagine the seller's hands, the buyer's voice, the noise of bargaining, all of it gone in an instant, replaced by silence and rot. And you realize the deserted market is more than a place without goods. It's a mirror of the world itself. A stage stripped of its actors, waiting for someone, anyone, to bring life back. The empty market fades into memory, and now you find yourself hearing the low drone of chanting. It rises from stone walls, echoing through cloisters where monks walk with bowed heads, rosaries clutched tight. In convents and abbeys across Europe, faith collides with plague, and monks and nuns find themselves at the front line, not by sword, but by service. Step into an infirmary run by Benedictines. Beds of straw line the floor, each one holding a patient sweating with fever, buboes swelling at neck and thigh. The air is thick with incense, meant to purify, and with the harsher smells of vinegar, urine, and death. Monks move from cot to cot, spooning broth into cracked lips, whispering prayers, wiping brows with cloth dipped in herbs. Their chants float over the moans, a steady rhythm that feels like an anchor in a storm. But devotion comes at a cost. Entire monastic communities are wiped out, their members falling one after another. You picture a line of monks in brown habits digging graves for their brothers, only to be buried there themselves days later. Some monasteries vanish entirely, their libraries abandoned, their gardens overgrown. The plague devours not just bodies but centuries of learning and prayer. Nuns too bear the weight. They care for orphans left in the streets, tend the dying with gentle hands, and sing hymns to comfort the last breaths. Some convents become havens, others cemeteries. A nun writes letters describing how she holds infants too weak to cry, baptizing them before they slip away. You can almost see her face lit by candlelight, weary but resolute. In a world where many fled from the sick, these women stepped closer. The paradox is striking. On one hand, the church loses so many of its servants that confidence falters. Parish priests die in droves, leaving villages without sacraments. Lay people begin to question whether the clergy truly hold divine protection. On the other hand, the heroism of monks and nuns shines through, remembered in chronicles as acts of selfless love. Historians still debate whether the plague weakened faith or deepened it, but in truth it did both, depending on who you were and what you lost. Even the rituals of devotion change. Processions once meant for celebration now become endless funerals. Relics are carried through towns, lifted high in hopes of miracles. Pilgrims walk barefoot from shrine to shrine, begging saints for mercy. Monks copy these pleas into their chronicles, ink smeared with trembling hands as if writing itself might shield them. And yet, humor sneaks in even here. One monk writes that his brothers prayed harder and ate faster, lest the plague take them before the meal was done. You almost laugh, picturing robed men hunched over bread and cheese, racing both hunger and death. Grim, yes, but undeniably human. You wander into a cloister garden. The herbs still grow, sage, thyme, rosemary, plants once thought to cleanse sickness. Bees hum lazily, indifferent to human tragedy. A single monk kneels by a bed of lavender, his voice soft as he recites psalms even though his brothers are gone. The air feels both holy and haunted. As you leave, you realize the plague tested devotion in ways no sermon ever could. Some found their faith shattered, others found it steeled, but all of them carried scars. And the silence that falls over the cloisters is a silence heavy with both loss and the faintest echo of resilience. The chants of monks fade, replaced now by the scratch of quills on parchment. You step into a small chamber, candlelight flickering over parchment sheets where trembling hands struggle to capture what eyes can hardly believe. Letters, chronicles, diaries. This is how some people poured their despair onto paper. And through their words, you feel the plague more intimately than through any grave or cart. A merchant in Florence writes to a partner in another city, "There is no business left to conduct, for there are no men left to buy or sell." His ink blots where his hand shakes, as though the weight of his own words crushes him. Another man records that funerals are so frequent, the bells ring without ceasing, until they become like the crowing of roosters at dawn, so constant they mean nothing at all. You pause over that line, realizing how terror numbs even symbols of mourning. A mother's note survives, smudged and faint, begging her sister to take in her children should she fall ill. The last sentence trails off mid-word, as though death itself interrupted her plea. You picture the parchment lying abandoned on a table, never delivered, the children's cries unanswered. These fragments hit harder than statistics. They are voices frozen mid-scream. Chroniclers in monasteries attempt objectivity, but their despair leaks through. One monk describes corpses stacked like winter logs. Another confesses he has written more names of the dead than prayers this year. Some admit openly that they doubt God's mercy, their ink smearing as tears fall onto the page. Historians still debate whether some accounts exaggerate numbers, but the raw fear? That's impossible to fake. Letters carry desperation across distance too. Imagine opening a missive from a relative in another town, only to read of empty streets, abandoned houses, children crying for parents who will never return. News doesn't bring comfort. It brings contagion of the mind, fear leaping from parchment into hearts before the sickness even arrives. Some writings mix tragedy with almost absurd detail. Her notary records that cats and dogs, once beloved, are killed en masse for fear they spread the plague, then complains that now the city is overrun with rats. You can't help but smirk bitterly. Medieval logic in action, chasing tails while the real enemy skitters unseen in the straw, and yet, amid despair, these letters preserve slivers of humanity. A friar writes of a wedding held despite the plague, two lovers refusing to delay. Another notes that a neighbor shared bread with his family, even as his own cupboard emptied. In the darkest pages, tiny sparks of kindness glow. You sit at the desk, running your fingers across the rough parchment, the ink faded but still legible. These words weren't meant for you. Yet here they are centuries later, whispering the truth of what it felt like to live inside the storm. Numbers tell you how many died. Letters tell you how it felt to die or to watch. And as the candle sputters low, you realize despair can be silent, but it can also be inked, etched into memory by hands too weary to hope and too desperate to stay quiet. The ink-stained letters fade from view, and now your steps carry you toward the looming silhouette of a castle. Its walls rise tall, banners limp in the wind, torches flickering along the battlements. You might think stone and privilege could keep the plague at bay, but the sickness does not care about titles, crowns, or fortresses. Lords and kings discovered that their power stopped cold at the edge of fever and buboes. Inside, great halls once filled with music and feasts now stand half empty. Servants cough in corners, knights avoid one another's eyes, and noble families whisper prayers in gilded chambers. The smell of rosemary and incense burns from braziers, perfumes meant to keep away bad air. Velvet curtains are drawn tight, windows shuttered, as though walls can block death. But the coughing still echoes through corridors, and the sound carries even in stone. Some lords flee to country estates, dragging retinues with them in hopes that distance equals safety. Yet even in the most remote manors the plague arrives. Perhaps it's a servant carrying the sickness unknowingly, or a visitor from a nearby village. Once inside, it spreads like fire through straw. Nobles find themselves dying on featherbeds, just as peasants did on straw mats. The illusion of difference crumbling with every funeral. Kings, too, face its reach. Edward III of England lost his daughter Joan to the plague as she travelled for a royal marriage. The Pope at Avignon ordered himself surrounded by fires, believing the heat would cleanse the air, an odd sort of medieval air purifier, but still watched his court thin daily. Chronicles record lords writing wills in a rush, handing lands to heirs barely old enough to walk. You imagine the quills scratching across parchment in panicked strokes, castles suddenly echoing with sobs. Historians still debate whether noble households suffered less due to their ability to isolate and stockpile food. But even if survival rates differed, the fear was the same. Imagine a banquet where goblets of wine sit untouched, nobles leaning away from one another as if distance across the table might matter. Imagine knights refusing to joust, pages refusing to serve, feasts interrupted by sudden coughing fits that send guests scattering. And yet, the plague reshaped the nobility in lasting ways. With heirs dying, titles shifted rapidly. Lands passed into unexpected hands, sometimes to women, sometimes to distant cousins, sometimes sparking disputes that led to bloodshed. Entire dynasties weakened, while new families rose from the ashes. In this way, the plague was not only an enemy, but a silent usurper, rearranging the chessboard of power. You walk through the castle courtyard and pause by a fountain, its water stagnant, petals from scattered herbs floating on the surface. A noblewoman leans against the stone, clutching a vial of perfume to her nose. She stares past you, hollow-eyed, knowing the plague laughs at her silks and jewels. In that moment, she is not a lady, not a title, just another frightened human waiting for a cough. And you realize the plague was the great equalizer. Gold could buy roses to mask the stench, wine to dull the fear, and walls to keep peasants out, but not one of those things could buy immunity. The echo of noble halls fades, and now you hear another sound, the creak of ropes, the snap of sails, the slap of waves against hulls. The plague did not just march along dusty roads, it rode the seas. Ships, with their holds packed full of goods and rats, became floating coffins that carried death from port to port. Imagine standing on the docks of Messina in 1347, watching Genoese galleys glide into the harbor. They've come from the Black Sea, their flags drooping, their crews strangely silent. Dock workers expect exotic wares, silk, spices, treasures, but instead they find sailors slumped over rails, faces grey, eyes glazed. Within days, the city is coughing, swelling, collapsing. That moment is often marked as the plague's European debut, and from there it spread as fast as the wind could fill sails. Ports that once bustled with life now stink of fear. Merchants glance nervously at arriving ships, unsure whether to welcome them or drive them away. Markets that depended on trade collapse overnight when rumor spreads that the sickness rides the waves. In Venice, officials scramble to respond. Their solution, 40 giorni, 40 days. Ships arriving from infected ports must wait offshore for that length of time before docking. The word quarantine is born, carved out of panic and necessity. Picture the scene. Vessels anchored just beyond reach of shore, crews waving desperately, their shouts carried by the wind. Supplies are rowed out cautiously, tossed aboard with minimal contact. Families wait on the docks for loved ones who never disembark. From land, the ships look like dark, bobbing silhouettes, ghosts on the water filled with sickness and silence. Not all obey the rules, of course. Smugglers slip in at night, desperate to sell goods. Deserters leap overboard and swim to shore, carrying fleas in their clothing. Fear and hunger push people to break the very boundaries meant to save them. The irony stings. The quarantine could work, but only if everyone respected it. And humans, then as now, aren't great at following rules when desperation knocks. Historians still debate how effective those early quarantines were, but one thing is certain: the idea stuck. The concept of isolating disease carriers became a cornerstone of public health. Strange to think, isn't it? Out of plague ships and panicked Venetians comes a practice still used centuries later, in times you know all too well. On the water, though, the reality was darker. Imagine being a sailor trapped for weeks offshore, watching the shore grow hazy in the distance while shipmates collapse around you. The smell of salt mixes with rot. Gulls circle above, and every sunrise brings fewer hands to pull the ropes. For some ships, 40 days wasn't long enough to wait. By the time the anchor lifted, the crew was already dead. As you leave the docks, the gulls' cries ring overhead, sharp and hollow. You realize that the sea, once a road to fortune, became the plague's highway instead. And out of its rolling waves rose one of humanity's earliest attempts at organized defense. Waiting, isolating, praying that time itself could starve the sickness out. The gulls fade into the distance, and now your steps carry you into a dimly lit chapel, its stone walls cool, its silence thick. But here the plague has not only taken lives, it has reshaped vision itself. Candles flicker against painted frescoes, against wooden panels, against sculptures where death stares back at you more vividly than ever before. Before the plague, art often showed heaven's light, saints in golden halos, Christ triumphant. After the plague, something shifts. Painters begin to fill their work with skeletons, grinning skulls, and the ever-present reminder of decay. Death is no longer hidden, it's center stage. The danse macabre appears in murals, skeletons leading kings, bishops, peasants, and children in a grim procession. The message is stark. No rank, no wealth, no prayer protects you from the dance. You imagine townsfolk staring at those walls, recognizing themselves in the figures, perhaps even laughing nervously at the blunt honesty. Sculptors chisel cadavers with worms crawling through their flesh, so-called transy tombs, monuments where nobles chose to be remembered, not as serene effigies but as rotting corpses. Imagine commissioning your tombstone and saying, "Yes, please, show me half decayed with ribs exposed." That'll cheer future generations. A strange mix of humility and horror, it reminded viewers that beneath silk and gold, bones wait for everyone. Manuscripts, too, change. Margins once filled with playful rabbits and flowers now sprout grotesque doodles. Dancing skeletons, plague demons, grotesque masks. Scribes, weighed down by funerals, let their ink reveal the darkness of their minds. Even in the illuminated glow of gold leaf, shadows creep. Music turns somber as well. Hymns of pleading replace chants of triumph. Minor tones echo through cloisters, voices rising thin and desperate. In some places, processions sing dirges daily, until the line between ritual and routine blurs. Imagine walking through town and hearing not one choir on Sunday, but endless voices mourning every day of the week. Historians argue whether this artistic shift was caused solely by the plague or by wider cultural changes. But the timing is undeniable. Death became unavoidable, so it seeped into paint, stone, ink, and song. What had been rare in art became omnipresent. Grinning skeletons in every chapel, death lurking in every page. And yet, it isn't only bleak. There's a strange comfort in it too. By painting death, people named it, gave it form. Skeletons could be laughed at, mocked, even danced with. To turn fear into an image was to wrestle control from the chaos. You sense that for many, looking at a fresco of death wasn't about despair. It was about acceptance. You step back into the chapel's nave, eyes adjusting to the flickering shadows. Above the altar, a mural shows Christ with one hand raised in blessing, and below him skeletons tugging at kings and peasants alike. It is chilling, but also grounding. The art whispers what everyone already knows. Death is not hiding in the shadows anymore. It's in the open part of the story, woven into the fabric of faith and daily life. And as you walk away, the thought lingers. Art did not save anyone from the plague, but it helped people see themselves in the horror, gave them a mirror in which to face what could not be avoided. The chapel's skeletons fade into memory, and now the scene shifts back to the fields. You walk along furrows half overgrown, past cottages with broken roofs, and you notice something unusual. The peasants who remain are no longer bowed as low. The plague has not only emptied graves, it has shaken society itself. With so many dead, labor grows scarce, and suddenly the humble hands that till the earth hold new power. Imagine being a farmer before the plague, tied to the land, owing rent to your lord, scraping through harvests while nobles feast. Now half your neighbors are gone. Your lord's coffers are thin and fields lie idle without you. Wages rise, sometimes doubling, as desperate lords bid against each other for scarce workers. You can almost see peasants crossing arms, smirking a little, demanding better pay before lifting their tools. For once the balance tilts, but not without backlash. Kings and nobles grow nervous, watching serfs taste independence. In England, the Statute of Labourers is issued, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers back to their lords. It's like trying to stuff a genie back into a bottle. Laws can be written, but hunger and ambition don't vanish. You picture royal clerks scratching parchment furiously, while out in the villages, peasants shrug and walk to the lord next door, who pays more anyway. The tension simmers for decades until it boils. In 1381, England erupts in the Peasants' Revolt, a fire sparked by taxes but fueled by long resentment. Crowds of villagers march on London crying for freedom, for fair wages, for an end to feudal bonds. Chroniclers describe mobs storming manors, burning records of debts, even confronting the king himself. Though the revolt is crushed, its echoes shake the foundations of society. Elsewhere in Europe, similar murmurs stir. Revolts break out in France, Italy, Flanders, some small, some brutal. Everywhere the same truth whispers. The plague killed millions, but it also killed inevitability. The order that once seemed eternal now cracks, and through those cracks slip new possibilities. Historians still debate how much the Black Death directly fueled these uprisings. Was it the shortage of labor? The desperation of lords? The rising expectations of peasants? Likely all three. But walk through a field where weeds cover half-sown furrows, and you feel it. A farmer who survives here is suddenly worth more than gold. Even in the daily grind, you sense the change. A peasant walks taller to market, bargaining with more confidence. A widow takes over her late husband's land and finds herself courted not for love but for her plough. Children inherit opportunities their parents never dreamed of. The air hums with a strange mixture of grief and possibility. And as you leave the fields behind, the thought lingers. The plague broke bodies, but it also broke chains. And its terrible shadow. Peasants glimpsed power, and once glimpsed it could never fully be unseen. The smoke of revolt drifts away, and now you walk through stone archways into a university town. Once these halls buzzed with debate, students crowding benches, masters lecturing in Latin, disputations echoing into courtyards. But the plague sweeps through here as ruthlessly as it does in markets and fields, and suddenly the halls of learning grow quiet. Picture Oxford or Paris at their height. Thousands of scholars crammed into drafty lecture rooms, quills scratching furiously, arguments spilling into taverns late at night. Now imagine half of them gone. Professors vanish, sometimes whole faculties lost in weeks. Students return home and never come back. Classes shrink, lectures cancel, degrees left unfinished. The sound of bells calling to disputations is replaced by the toll for funerals. Libraries, too, feel the silence. Scribes who once copied manuscripts die mid-project, leaving pages blank. Books sit untouched, dust gathering where eager hands once turned them. Knowledge doesn't vanish entirely, but it slows as though the very flow of ideas has caught fever. You glance at a shelf where half-copied texts wait for ink that will never come. Some universities shut their doors entirely for years. Others stagger on, patching classes with whoever remains. Chroniclers note that whole disciplines suffer. Medicine, ironically, loses many of its leading voices, leaving gaps that take generations to fill. Philosophy lectures dwindle. Law, once booming with ambitious clerks, thins as courts close and officials die, and yet necessity sparks adaptation. With so many physicians gone, young apprentices rise faster. New ideas about contagion, air and quarantine creep into medical texts, fumbling toward truths not yet fully formed. Historians still debate whether the plague slowed intellectual progress or simply redirected it, but the silence of empty classrooms feels undeniable. You pass by a courtyard, where once students argued about Aristotle. Now a handful remain huddled, their laughter thin but persistent. One reads aloud from a tattered book, voice echoing in the hollow space. It feels both fragile and defiant. Even in despair, learning limps forward. The plague also reshapes language itself. With so many Latin-trained clerks gone, vernacular languages creep upward in status. Contracts, wills, even chronicles are written in French, English, Italian, rather than the scholar's Latin. It's as if the plague shakes not only lives, but the very words used to remember them. Imagine walking through one of these silent lecture halls. Benches empty, chalkboards bare, the smell of extinguished candles hanging in the air. You can almost hear ghostly echoes of debates long past, voices that will never return. The silence of scholars is not just absence, it's a pause in humanity's attempt to understand itself. And as you leave the university gates, you realize the plague killed knowledge as surely as it killed flesh. But in the cracks left behind, new voices, new tongues, new paths of thought began to grow. The echo of empty lecture halls trails behind you, but the weight that replaces it is heavier still. You step into a quiet chamber, where a lone man sits by the fire, his head bowed in his hands. He is alive, but around him everyone else is gone. The plague has left not just emptiness, but a gnawing ache, the guilt of survival. Imagine waking in the morning to find your household silent, your wife taken by fever, your children buried yesterday, Your neighbor's doors bolted shut with no answer. You breathe, you eat, you keep walking. And yet each step feels stolen. Why you? Why not them? Survivor's guilt is not a modern idea. It lingered even then, though no one had the words for it. Chroniclers describe people muttering that they were cursed to live, as though death had been a mercy denied them. Some turned to prayer, kneeling in chapels until their knees bleed, begging God to explain why they were spared. Others drink, laugh too loudly, plunge into taverns as though noise can drown memory. You picture a man raising a cup in a half-empty hall, toasting companions who will never answer. The humor feels brittle, the laughter too sharp, like glass ready to crack. And then there are those who wander. Survivors leave their villages, unable to look at the fields where loved ones once worked. They drift from town to town, carrying nothing but memories. You meet one such woman on the road, her eyes hollow, clutching a rosary worn smooth. She doesn't look sick, but she looks haunted. The plague didn't touch her skin, it touched her soul. Historians still debate how widespread this psychological scar was, since medieval people lacked the language of trauma. But hints appear everywhere. Wills rewritten obsessively, prayers scribbled into margins, confessions of unworthiness. In Florence, Boccaccio writes of those who turned wild, living only for pleasure, because they could not bear to carry grief. In England, records show sudden donations to churches, as if wealth could buy redemption for merely surviving. You glance at the man by the fire again. He whispers to no one, recounting names of the dead as if to keep them alive. His face twists, not with fever but with shame. You can almost hear the thought circling in his mind. What did I do to live when they did not? Even children who survive carry the shadow. Imagine a boy whose siblings lie in shallow graves, who grows up as the only branch left on a broken tree. Every laugh feels tinged with absence. Every joy feels tempered by ghosts. Survivor's guilt may not leave scars on the body, but it carves deep lines into the heart. And yet in this heaviness, you sense resilience too. To live through devastation is to bear guilt, but it is also to carry memory. Each survivor becomes an unwilling witness, the one left to tell the story. Their pain ensures that the lost are not entirely erased. As you leave the chamber, the man's whispers follow you like echoes in the dark. And you realize the plague killed millions, but it left millions more living with the unbearable burden of why not me. The whispers of guilt fade into the distance, replaced by the low rumble of chanting in a vast cathedral. You step inside expecting to feel awe, but the atmosphere is fractured. Priests move hurriedly through incense clouds, their eyes weary, their robes stained not with gold thread, but with sweat and ash. The plague has not only broken families and villages, it has cracked the very foundation of the clergy itself. In the early days, people turned to the church for answers. Priests preached that sin had brought God's wrath, urging confession, repentance, and prayer. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, prayers piled up like corpses, and still the sickness spread. People began to murmur, if priests are holy, why do they die like the rest of us? If God listens, why does he stay silent? Some clergy rose to the challenge, working tirelessly in sick rooms, holding hands as fevers burned, giving last rites until their voices broke. You imagine a priest walking barefoot through empty streets, his bell clanging softly, announcing, "The priest comes for the dying." He enters homes no one else dares to, whispers prayers over the weak, and collapses days later himself. These acts of courage shine recorded in chronicles with reverence, but others fled. Bishops retreated to countryside estates. Monks closed monastery gates. Priests vanished from parishes. Parishioners gathered for mass, only to find no one at the altar. Rumors swelled that the clergy cared more for gold than souls. Confidence cracked. You can almost hear villagers spitting in disgust, muttering that their priests abandoned them when they were needed most. Historians still debate how deeply this betrayal eroded faith, but evidence is everywhere. Donations to the church dip. Criticism of clerical luxury grows sharper, and lay movements, flagellants, mystics, heretical sects gain followers hungry for answers. The plague did not destroy religion, but it shifted its center of gravity, loosening the clergy's iron grip. The papacy itself trembles. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI surrounds himself with torches, believing fire purifies the air. He grants sweeping indulgences to the dead, so that souls might skip purgatory entirely. It is both grand and desperate, a papal act that admits the scale of helplessness. Even the shepherd struggles to lead when wolves come from every direction. Imagine kneeling in a cathedral where dozens of priests once chanted, now reduced to a handful of voices. The echo is thin. The incense stings your nose and you feel less comfort than unease. Faith remains, but certainty fractures. The plague leaves behind not just bodies, but questions that cannot be answered by sermons alone. And yet, paradoxically, devotion deepens in some hearts. Some believers cling tighter, convinced that only stricter piety can avert wrath. Pilgrimages increase, relics multiply. New mystics claim visions of Christ and the Virgin, warning of judgment. The cracks in clerical authority let new forms of spirituality seep through. You leave the cathedral and look back at its towering spire, rising into the grey sky. It is beautiful but scarred. The bells toll, but their notes sound strained. And you realize the plague did not topple the church, but it shook it so violently that faith would never sound quite the same again. The cathedral spire fades behind you, and now your feet press into soil that tells its own story. The land itself has changed under the weight of the plague. Where once every field was tilled, every meadow grazed, now whole stretches of countryside lie empty, furrows filled with weeds, hedgerows creeping back across abandoned plots. The earth breathes differently, as if reclaiming what humans once claimed too tightly. Imagine walking through a valley where smoke once curled from dozens of chimneys. Now only a few rise, scattered and uncertain. Roofs sag, cottages crumble, and wildflowers overtake gardens once kept neat. Deer wander closer to villages. Wolves stalk edges of farms. Birds nest undisturbed in rafters. With fewer people to push them back, nature advances, indifferent to grief. The change is not just visual, it is practical. Fields rot unharvested. Orchards overflow with fruit that falls and ferments where it lands. Roads crack from neglect. Bridges wash away in floods without carpenters to mend them. Rivers flow faster and cleaner in places once clogged by mills. It's as though the land itself sighs, shaking off centuries of ploughing, letting green creep in where ploughs no longer pass. But the scars of the plague are not only growth, they are wounds. Mass graves disrupt farmland, pits of bones altering soil. Villages vanish, their names lost except in the margins of old tax rolls. Some regions see whole districts collapse into wilderness. Travelers describe stretches where they could walk for miles without meeting a soul. Imagine that, Europe, a continent thick with villages, suddenly pocked with silence. Historians debate how much the environment improved in some ways, cleaner rivers, more forest, yet also how much infrastructure decayed. What's certain is that the plague left marks deeper than stone walls or parchment. It reshaped the land as surely as it reshaped society, and in the emptiness, new opportunities sprout. Peasants who remain claim larger plots. Sheep graze where wheat once grew, because fewer hands are needed for wool than for harvest. The great sheep flocks of England swell, laying foundations for future wealth built on cloth. You can almost see it, rolling hills dotted with white flecks, the sound of bleating replacing the clang of harvest tools. But the beauty carries a shadow. Each new meadow of flowers blooms where families once lived. Each thicket of trees grows, because children are no longer there to cut them back. The landscape is a memorial in green, every empty patch whispering names no one remembers. You pause on a hilltop, looking down at a wide expanse of abandoned farmland, dotted with crumbling cottages and overgrown hedges. It is peaceful, almost lovely, but eerie. The plague has written itself not only in graves and chronicles, but in the very soil, in the silence of valleys that should be alive with voices. And you realize the earth does not mourn or celebrate. It simply reclaims. Where people falter, the land moves on indifferent, covering scars with roots and leaves. Humanity may never forget, but nature doesn't pause to remember. The overgrown fields fade from sight as you turn toward the survivors who remain, their lives reshaped by absence. The plague, for all its horror, leaves behind something unexpected: opportunity. When half of a village is gone, when cottages stand empty and land lies untended, those who survive suddenly inherit a world with more space, more goods, more choices than ever before. Imagine a poor laborer who once worked dawn to dusk for a crust of bread and a patch of ground not his own. Now, with his neighbors gone, he claims their fields. The Lord, desperate to keep the land productive, agrees to rent it cheaply or even grant ownership outright. That same man who once bent under burdens now walks taller, his children clothed better, his table fuller. Death has rewritten his fortune. Widows, too, find new paths. With husbands gone, many women manage farms, shops, even workshops. Some remarry quickly. Demand is high when populations are low, but others remain independent, controlling property in ways they never could before. You picture a woman standing in her late husband's stall, selling wool with a sharp tongue and sharper arithmetic, earning respect once reserved only for men. Servants and apprentices climb ladders faster than ever. A boy who once fetched water now inherits his master's forge. A girl who scrubbed floors now finds herself running a household. Opportunities appear suddenly, as though society has been shaken like a snow globe, and the pieces fall in strange new places. Even towns change. Empty houses are bought cheaply, allowing families to move upward, from cramped huts to spacious homes. Markets may be quiet, but the few who remain can claim prime stalls once fought over by many. Survivors who once lived in the shadows of nobles now taste freedoms unthinkable before the plague. Historians still argue whether this betterment was immediate or gradual, but the pattern is clear. Labor scarcity gave workers bargaining power. In England and beyond, lords tried to freeze wages with harsh laws, but reality undermined paper. Peasants simply walked to the next estate, leaving stubborn masters helpless. The very structure of feudalism began to crack under the pressure. You wander through a village where laughter cautiously returns. A child runs across a field that now belongs to his family. A widow stacks loaves on her stall, nodding firmly at customers. A blacksmith, once an apprentice, hammers at an anvil with pride, his own anvil now, not borrowed. The air still smells of loss, but woven through it is something new, the scent of possibility. And yet that possibility carries guilt, too. Every gain is born from absence. Every new field reminds the farmer of the neighbor buried in it. Every larger home carries echoes of the family who no longer laughs within its walls. Opportunity and grief walk hand in hand, inseparable companions in this new world. As you leave the village, you realize the plague was not only destruction, it was transformation, brutal and swift, tearing down lives but also clearing space for new ones. For those who survived, the question was no longer only how to endure, but how to rebuild. What to do with the strange, terrible gift of survival. The hum of rebuilding fades, and what rises in its place is a murmur of whispers, odd tales, charms, and rituals born of fear. For when reason fails, people turn to belief, and during the plague, those beliefs grow stranger than ever. Superstition becomes as common as prayer, and folklore blooms like weeds in the cracks of certainty. You hear of villagers hanging red cloth across doors, convinced the color itself will ward off sickness. Others burn herbs at crossroads at midnight, believing the smoke will drive away demons. Mothers tie amulets of iron or written prayers around their children's necks, hoping metal or words can act as shields. Imagine children clinking as they run, more charms than toys, their parents watching anxiously to see if the plague dares to cross the boundary. Astrologers find their moment too. Charts are drawn feverishly, planets blamed for lining up in ominous ways. One learned man declares that Saturn and Jupiter's conjunction in Aquarius corrupted the air itself. People nod solemnly, though they barely understand, grateful at least to have a culprit other than their own sins. Historians still debate how many truly believe these explanations, but the records are full of astrological treatises, all certain the stars themselves were sick. And then there are the folk remedies that border on absurd. Carrying a dead toad in your pocket, drinking a potion made from ground-up emeralds, sniffing rose petals soaked in vinegar. Some swear by rubbing onions on the skin, others by avoiding baths altogether, lest pores open and let in pestilence. You almost laugh imagining the smell of a town where everyone avoids bathing, but douses themselves in garlic, safer from plague perhaps, but not from each other's noses. Rumors spread like fever too. That Jews poisoned wells, that witches called the sickness down, that travelers carried cursed powders. Innocents suffer as mobs act on these whispers, hunting scapegoats to soothe their fear. The line between belief and cruelty blurs quickly, and suspicion becomes as deadly as any flea. Yet not all strange beliefs are cruel. Some are simply desperate. People sleep with windows open to let death pass through, or paint protective symbols above doors. Pilgrims walk barefoot across miles, convinced that each blister earns divine mercy. Parents leave offerings at shrines of obscure saints, hoping forgotten holy names might have power where famous ones fail. You wander into a cottage where a family has hung bunches of herbs from every rafter, garlic braided along the walls, and a bowl of vinegar sits on the table with coins soaking inside. They glance at you with nervous eyes, as if daring you to mock their efforts. You don't. Because even if the charms do nothing against the plague, they do something against despair. They give people the illusion of control, the comfort of action in a world gone silent. And you realize strange beliefs, however bizarre, are simply the shape fear takes when it's too heavy to carry bare. They are shields woven from imagination, fragile but necessary, keeping hopelessness at bay, one charm, one chant, one herb at a time. The charms of garlic and red cloth fade into memory, and now you look up, far beyond the cramped cottages and silent streets. The plague has passed in waves, but its shadow stretches centuries. It did not simply kill, it reshaped the very bones of the world. Society itself bends. With labor scarce, wages rise and feudal bonds loosen. The old order of lords and serfs begins to crumble. Where once peasants bent low in fields, they now bargain harder, walk away when mistreated, or take up abandoned land as their own. You can almost hear the creak of feudalism's foundations as it shifts under the weight of absence. Historians still debate whether the Black Death was the death blow to serfdom, but its role in loosening chains is undeniable. Cities change too. Quarantine, once a desperate Venetian invention, becomes a standard practice. Town councils grow more powerful, managing health and order when kings and popes falter. Civic life takes on new importance, laying early seeds for urban governance, for the idea that communities themselves, not just monarchs, can decide survival. Art and thought tilt as well. Grim skeletons dance across frescoes, transy tombs stare at passers-by with rotting faces, and sermons take sharper tones about mortality. The obsession with death, strange as it seems, paves the way for new reflections about life. In Italy, the very generation that grew up in the shadow of the plague would later fuel the Renaissance, their creativity sharpened by an acute awareness that life is brief and fragile. Imagine that. Death as midwife to beauty, economies shift. Wool and cloth grow dominant in England. New trade routes open and fortunes rearrange. Inheritance cascades through families so quickly that unexpected heirs find themselves suddenly wealthy. A farmer's son may wake one day a landowner. A widow may become a merchant. A guild apprentice may inherit an entire workshop. Out of loss comes upheaval, and out of upheaval comes opportunity. Even faith transforms. The plague does not erase belief, but it shakes trust in the clergy. Some believers turn inward, embracing mysticism, private prayer, or fringe movements. Others cling harder, convinced stricter devotion is the only path. The diversity of responses widens the cracks in Christendom, setting the stage for Reformation centuries later. And beyond all this, something subtler lingers: memory. The children who played ring-around games carry that shadow into adulthood. Survivors whisper stories to grandchildren of carts creaking and bells tolling. Towns remember mass graves beneath their fields. The plague doesn't just shape history, it shapes imagination. Once a society has seen half its people vanish, it never forgets. You stand on a hilltop watching villages, fields, and cities below. They look familiar. Plows still cut furrows, bells still ring, markets still murmur. But beneath every sound lies an echo, the world before and the world after. They are not the same. They cannot be the same. The plague has etched itself into law, art, faith, and memory, a scar too deep to fade. And you realize, while the plague seemed like an ending, it was also a beginning. A brutal reshaping, carving the contours of the world to come. The reshaped world stretches before you, yet the air is still thick with memory. Even as new fields are plowed, as markets stir again, as children are born into quieter villages, the echoes of the plague do not vanish. They hang in the corners of life like shadows at dusk, reminders of what was endured and what could return. Imagine sitting by a hearth decades after the worst has passed. A grandfather leans in, his voice low, recounting the days of silence when carts rattled through streets and bells never stopped tolling. His grandchildren listen wide-eyed, their hands clenching toys, sensing that this is not a story but a scar. Across Europe, these fireside tales carry the memory forward, so that even those untouched by the plague grow up with its chill in their bones. Fear becomes tradition. Annual processions commemorate the dead. Mass graves covered in grass are whispered about as haunted places. Churches keep plague relics, cloths said to have covered bodies, crosses carried during processions, as warnings and talismans. You picture villagers crossing themselves whenever they pass a certain field, the memory lingering longer than the bones beneath, and fear shapes behavior too. The next time sickness appears, even if it is small, people react with panic. Doors slam, markets close, rumors flare. The ghost of the Black Death teaches caution, sometimes wise, sometimes paranoid. Historians still debate whether later outbreaks were worsened by fear itself, as towns cut themselves off in haste, or scapegoats were hunted before reason had time to intervene. The echo is cultural as well. Art continues to dance with skeletons. Literature lingers on mortality, on fragile life, on fleeting joy. Philosophers write of man's smallness, poets of the certainty of death. Even in laughter you hear it, the undertone of having lived too close to the abyss. And then there are the personal echoes, invisible but sharp. Survivors wake at night, hearing again the cough of a spouse long gone. Parents linger too long over children's beds, terrified of losing them, in the same way they lost others. Couples marry younger, eager to seize life before death interrupts. A sense of urgency, of fragility threads through daily life. You stand in a town square decades later, where the plague is gone but not forgotten. People trade again, bells ring again, children laugh again, but carved into the stones of the church, painted into murals, sung in hushed chants at vigils, the memory remains. The plague is no longer here, but its echo hums in the air, a reminder that the world can collapse swiftly and without mercy. And you realize, the plague was never only about the years it raged. It was about the centuries of memory it left behind, shaping how people saw life, death, and each other long after the last pit was filled. The echoes of fear grow softer now, like bells fading into the mist, and you find yourself walking along a quiet road at dusk. The plague has passed, its waves receding, leaving behind silence, scars, and a changed world. The grief is heavy, yes, but so too is the strange resilience that hums quietly through the survivors' lives. And as the sky darkens, so does your journey, slowing, softening, easing toward rest. You picture fields once abandoned, now green again, dotted with sheep. Town squares hum with life, though never quite as loudly as before. Children's voices rise, fragile but insistent, weaving laughter back into places that once knew only silence. The plague has reshaped everything: faith, power, art, memory. But humanity moves forward all the same, step by step, season by season, breath by breath. And yet, even as life rebuilds, the shadow lingers. In murals of skeletons leading kings to their dance, in stories whispered by firesides, in prayers spoken with an edge of fear, the plague endures. It doesn't vanish, it becomes part of the rhythm, a dark note in the song of history. You sense that is the truest legacy, not only what it destroyed, but how it taught people to hold life closer, tighter, with trembling but determined hands. Now, as the road grows quieter, the torchlight dimmer, your steps slow. The images blur, the carts, the bells, the cloisters, the markets. Faces fade into shadows, laughter dissolves into silence, and even the skeletons in their macabre dance step back into the dark. The air is gentler now, no longer choked with smoke or incense, but cool and still, carrying the faint hum of distant voices that slowly fade into nothing. Your eyelids grow heavy as the story unwinds. The weight of history softens, like a blanket pulled close, and the world of plague and panic drifts away. All that remains is the quiet, the steady rhythm of your breath, and the sense that even in the worst storms, humanity always finds its way back to light. So rest now. Let the flicker of fear turn to embers. Let the noise of sorrow dissolve into hush. The long sleep calls gently, wrapping you in silence, carrying you far from the cries of bells and the rattle of carts. Nothing pursues you here. Nothing lingers but calm end of script, sweet dreams.